I worked with John, geez, it's been 17, 18 years ago. We went up after the blowdown in the Boundary Waters with Lee Freilich, and there was a series of old growth white cedar that we ensured Lee and yourself that we would protect when they started lighting, and we did. We almost lost it, but we ended up protecting it. So we're glad to have John here to give us a unique perspective. John is the outdoor environment reporter for the Duluth News-Tribune, where he's worked for more than 33 years. He's covered a multitude of beats and subjects, including 8 years reporting on state government and covering the Minnesota legislature at the Capitol. He spent more than 20 years as an environment and a natural resource reporter, covering issues as varied as invasive species, forest fires, endangered species, public land management, forest fragmentation, logging, and especially mining. He took over as paper's outdoor writer in May 2018 and now focuses his reporting on outdoor recreation like fishing, hunting, hiking, boating, camping, which is great because that's what he loves to do. He's an avid bird hunter and Labrador Retriever owner and spends too much of his time at the Duck Fishing Shack on Ontario side of Lake of the Woods. John graduated from the University of St. Thomas, majoring in journalism and political science, and previously worked at newspapers in Washaka and Grantsburg, Wisconsin. Sorry, it's not Missouri. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, John.
I don't know. Yeah, she says it's going to go. Okay, so I don't need this?
Yeah,
no, that's for you. Okay.
Sorry, this one's for, I'm being selfish. That's
Okay.
for me, that's for them.
All right, thanks, Bruce, and thanks everybody for having me. I told him in May or June when he called and said, "You don't remember me?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." But I said I still feel out of place here. I'm usually used to calling you people up or talking to you, or getting together in person if I'm lucky enough and have enough time, and writing stories about what you do. And I don't get to normally talk about what I do. So the roles are a little bit reversed here. This is a really unscientific, laid back. We didn't have PowerPoint because my company's too cheap to have PowerPoint, but we have something called Google Slides, which actually appears to be working. We'll see if it works. So, and I don't normally give presentations, so at noon yesterday I said, "Oh, can someone in the newsroom show me how to use Google Slides?" So this was literally put together on a shoestring yesterday afternoon. And I'm going to start with a real personal anecdote here and talk about over the 50 years and how habitats have changed, because I think that's sort of what this was based on. And I'm going to talk about a habitat way up in northeastern Minnesota, up in Cook County, north of Hovland, where my family had been deer hunting since 1932. My grandpa and then my dad and then me. We didn't shoot a lot of deer. I think it was 4 or 5 years into it before I actually saw a deer. But that area, of course, never lost its wolves, as Bill knows well. But I could go, this is land owned by Consolidated Paper Company, be just to the west side of what is now Judge Magny State Park. And I could get out of the car at first, and eventually we got a four-wheel drive, and walk all day long and never see another human being. And I mean, it's like, to imagine be able to deer hunt. I mean, you can't walk 100 yards now deer hunting and not see somebody else. But never had stands. We just still hunted, and actually, we did okay. But one day we had built a few stands on the consolidated land. We didn't call for permission, but we did it anyway. It must have been the late 1980s, and I crawled into my deer stand. I walked about a mile from the truck, no ATV. We'll talk about that later. And as the sun was coming up, I looked over and I said, "My God, look at that deer trail. It looks like they've just been, it's like the crosstown freeway. There just must be going up and down there." And as the sun got up higher and higher, and of course there was no deer around, I thought, what in the heck is that? So I crawled down my stand, walked over there, and I saw a sign that said Lake Superior Hiking Trail. What the hell is this? They built the Lake Superior Hiking Trail 50 feet from my deer stand, And I was going to call and complain and say, "That's my," oh, wait a minute, it's not my property. Darn, I can't do that. So, and I don't know, is that good or bad? It was just sort of civilization encroaching on John Mayer's own wilderness up there. So, but then it goes on to beyond that. So eventually, what do we have? I'm just talking about, this is just sort of what I'm talking about. And I first thought this was the Wilderness Society, but then I realized it wasn't, so I made it wildness instead of wilderness. And you guys aren't nearly as radical as they are. But to kind of elaborate on, that was my wife. Before she was my wife, she looks like she's 12, but she's like 24, they're honest. So, and that deer was shot from the stand that I was just talking about. But this same land, right after the hiking trail incident, a couple years later, and we still hunted there because nobody hiked in November, so it was all right. But Consolidated decided they wanted to get out of the owning land in Minnesota. They were a Wisconsin-based company, I believe, and they just didn't want to own land anymore, so they logged the heck out of most of it, and then walked away, and they eventually made some sort of a deal with the Trust for Public Land. The Trust for Public Land acquired this land, and I just found out about it at the wrong time, because right when I found out about it, oh, that's great, the Trust for Public Land has bought this, but no, they didn't really want this land because it had just been logged. It's only a couple miles from the road, so they traded it for some land right around the edges of the boundary waters, which is their goal, to preserve land around the boundary waters. It all sounded great, and when I write about those things, they all sound great. But the upshot is that my land got sold. My land, right? Okay, remember, it's the Myers land from 1932 to 2002, when by 2002, it had been sold off into 160, and then an 80, and then to multiple 40s, and then the signs go up, no trespassing without permission, so I would track down people to get permission. Most of the people had never even been on the land. They were just buying a chunk of 40 in the woods that they wanted along the North Shore. Some places, if you got up high enough, you could see the lake. Gorgeous land. And eventually, they started building their little cabins on the land. And so by 2002, it was getting impossible for me to walk a mile or so, let alone all day long. And it was, people were encroaching. We had to move some of where we used to hunt. And it just got too much. And after 70 years of hunting in virtually the same spot, the Myers family gave up. And to be honest with you, I stopped deer hunting in Minnesota after that. And it was kind of an emotional thing, as much as, it just didn't feel right anymore. And I felt sort of aggrieved by that. But this isn't the same spot, but this is exactly what's happening. And I think as much as anything else, we can blame these large events like climate change, but a lot of it is just everybody, it's based on this population thing, and it's based on the fact that, well, we still have a huge disparity in income. There's enough of the rich people out there, or rich compared to, I guess, if you live in Somalia, that can afford, Block 1, Block 2 on Sugarloaf Highlands. And this is happening all up and down, the areas that I used to spend a lot of time in, on the North Shore, St. Louis County, Lake County, Cook County. And then, of course, this is what you get then. So it was a big part of sort of changing the landscape of what we look like, and a little less wildness as more people moved out there. And I'll bounce back to this to that sort of theme later. But I don't think this has been talked a lot about. But 50 years ago, we're supposed to talk about 50 years ago, and I was just getting into getting out of my diapers a little bit later than that. But and getting a 20 gauge to go grouse hunting, but nobody had ever heard of one of these. I mean, you might have seen a 3-wheeler somewhere, and now they are ubiquitous. And I talk about subtle changes. This isn't an invasive species. This isn't climate change, but it has become a major driving force in what our North Woods looks like. It's become how we deer hunt, how we grouse hunt. And this is a slide. I hope you can see it. Does this pointer work? Okay, this is, I believe, Lake Cabotogama. I think here's Namakan. This would be Highway 53, I think. This would be the Ash River Trail. I'm pretty sure I got it right. I just, a couple weeks ago, spent a couple days up in Voyagers Park with these really phenomenal wolf researchers. They are, mid-20s versions of what you folks do or did when you're in the field or do. They're just rock stars because they not only are really good scientists, they love to talk about it with the public. They get it, they get social media, but they're just finding out really cool things about wolves in the summer that, Dave Meach couldn't do. So nothing against Dave Meach or Bill Berg for that matter. But what this is that, so they've got GPS collars on 40-some wolves or at one point or another. I think there's like 29 there. They get a signal every 20 minutes. And what they do is they go out and try to find where these wolves have been and where they've killed beaver. And by the way, these wolves up here are eating a lot of beaver, especially May, June, July. They'll take a few weeks off to kill fawns, but they love beaver. And so when they go out, instead of bushwhacking, when they're up on the Cab Peninsula where there are no roads, and you can just see a little bit of that, when there are no trails, it's really tough for them. So they love it when they get outside the park boundaries to chase these wolves, because the wolves don't know where the park boundaries are. Actually, maybe they do. But so these are actual trails that have been GPS confirmed by just these 8 or 9 people that are doing this wolf research. And it's most of it's on like state forest, county forest. There's a little bit of Superior National Forest. Much of it's private. Some of it, there are actually trails inside the national park. That's not supposed to happen. I don't know how that happens. But, and these are just the ones that have been GPS confirmed by these guys as they're out walking. They love it because they can get to all these wolf sites. They get to wolf dens. They get to wolf rendezvous sites. They get to wolf kills, hours, days after the stuff happens. They have trail cameras set up. They have incredible footage inside and outside wolf dens. But the thing that just struck me, because this is up on a big map, because they're using it to navigate, and I'm using it going, oh my God. I mean, this is like what we think of as one of the most wild areas of our states, and it's literally crisscrossed with ATV trails. And they're not all, I mean, a lot of them are deer hunters. Most of them are probably deer hunters, and some of them are logging roads. They're not all ATV trails. But it's just, that's what northern Minnesota is right now. And I think, that was just sitting on a wall, and a couple weeks after I got back, I said, would you please send me an image of that? Because I want to use it in this little chat that I'm giving here. This is an invasive species. We're talking about habitat. This is, I believe, Japanese knotweed in the city of Duluth. Some people call it bamboo or whatever it is. And it's literally just taken over every place in Duluth. It's incredibly invasive. And we don't really know what it's going to do for habitat. I mean, it would be great if deer wouldn't eat it, because it would be the one thing they wouldn't eat. But so we don't know where that's going. And I think on a habitat level, with invasive terrestrial and amphibious species, aquatic invaders, what these things are going to do to our habitat in the long run is, I don't think we know yet. I mean, we've talked a little bit about emerald ash borer, and I've got him coming up here. This was actually taken in Superior, Wisconsin, by one of our photographers. And when they hit, and somebody already talked about this, again, that's the perils of being last, is a lot of the things I want to talk about are already covered. But when they hit the black ash forests in Minnesota, what's going to happen? We don't know what that's going to do. There are UMD scientists that are trying to figure out what's going to happen to the water table, what replaces that, what could you do in advance, what could you, maybe plant on purpose that would try to soak up some of that water. But that's going to be a landscape level change. And people were saying, oh, we hit 40 below up there, it's great there, it's going to kill all the emerald ash borers. And it's just not the case. They're surviving in northern Michigan, they're surviving in Ontario. 40 below will knock them back, but it's not the elixir. If we get a couple 40 below, it might slow them down a couple years. But the more we move, these things came from a packing crate, a wooden packing crate that was unloaded in Michigan somewhere, I believe, or in Hamilton, Ontario. But and it came from that's where they all came from. One load from China in wooden packing crates that weren't treated, and that's changing our forests, and it's going to change our habitat. The moose. Everybody's talked a lot about. There's been a lot of talk about moose, but I like to say, Bill talked about the northwestern herd, and actually, it's not all media have ignored it. I've talked about it. And it was a very early scientific, local, our backyard documentation of what climate change is doing. It's hard to explain because it's not because it's 90. They're not dying because it hit 90 one day, but they're dying because it's too warm too often. And in northeastern Minnesota, a lot. Everybody's pointing fingers at all sorts of different directions. Wolves are getting a big hit, and they, wolves take a lot of moose. There's no doubt about that, especially calves. They're having a hard time keeping up. There's not enough calves being born to repopulate. But I think the number one killer of adult moose in the study so far is P. tenuis, and it's brainworm from deer. And we changed the habitat of northern Minnesota when we logged it off the first time, and when we logged it off the second time, all that 1950s, 30-year-old and less aspen. That brought the deer north, all the fires that happened after that. Perfect deer habitat. And moose, as are caribou, highly susceptible to P. tenuis. So not a direct human correlation. We're not killing moose, but it's the result of our interactions with the landscape, with the logging. And I think to a large extent, we can blame, a lot of people are blaming wolves for the demise of moose in northeastern Minnesota, when I believe the moose could probably handle living with wolves pretty well. They just don't live very well with deer. Same with caribou. I was writing a lot about a plan to reintroduce woodland caribou into the core areas of the boundary waters. It was the least deer of anywhere in the state of Minnesota. And there were a couple of really big promoters. One was a math teacher up in Duluth, and another Fish and Wildlife Service guy in the cities. And they were that close. They were going to take caribou from the Slate Islands, which that's another whole story. We almost lost all of them. But and Lake Superior, and bring them over there. And then the blowdown hit. And immediately everybody said, oh, well, that's it, we're done. And I said, well, why? Why does that affect it? They said, well, with the down timber and the young forest that's going to come from both the blowdown and the fires that followed, and the fires did follow, there's just going to be too many deer up there. And caribou, more so than moose, are susceptible to. So the whole idea of bringing caribou back, reintroducing an extirpated species, was completely shot by one wind event on one day in 1999. This is an example that actually a story I've been writing a lot about, probably nobody else has, is the declining birch along the North Shore. I think you might have seen a story I did in the Volunteer on this. I used to do a lot more for the Volunteer. I've been too busy lately. I did stories about the lead tackle story. I remember interviewing Pam on that, and we can talk about water gremlin and Rapala and Northland tackle and why we don't have a ban on tiny lead tackle. It would be infinitesimal impact on fishermen. One of our state senators, Yvonne Pretner-Solon, actually had a bill that got into a committee, and all the corporate heads came, and that was the end of that. But that's a different story. But it just reminded me of that, Pam, when you talked about that. And but the declining North Shore birch thing, I remember the story that I wrote for the Volunteers. I remember this succinctly. Driving up the North Shore, my parents used to have a camper in the Grand Marais Municipal Campground, gorgeous spot right in the lake. We were driving up early one morning in my wife's Jeep, and I was looking around, and it was 1980. I can't remember what it was, but it might have been like 1991 or something. And I looked around, and all these birch were dead. And I'm thinking, what the heck happened? Was an insect outbreak? Well, it was the drought of 1988, and people remember some drought years. 76 was a bad one in Minnesota. 1988 was a really bad drought, a lot of fires. But a lot of these old birch trees got stressed, and they don't live that long anyway. I'm telling some of you people things that you know way more than I do. But it was just sort of the end of the road, and I thought, well, why isn't there anything else growing there? Well, that's because the grass is covering the ground. Seeds can't take hold. Well, why is the grass there? Well, the fires that came through after the logging of the white pine burned that soil. The North Shore normally didn't burn because it was too humid, too cool, too close to Lake Superior. But after those big slash pile burnings, it did. And this is one of your own DNR incredibly bright non-game people or ecological services people up on the North Shore, and I can't remember her name right now. But she was explaining all this to me, and it was just a fascinating story. And I talked to people in the Volunteer and letting me to write about it. But it was all these human interactions: the logging, the fires, the deer moving in again. You can't reproduce white pine like they want to do up there because the deer just mow them down. So you either have to bud cap them or fence them in. In this case up here, they're fencing them in. But there's a whole effort up there. This is kind of a good news, bad news, good news story called the North Shore Collaborative, and it's the U.S. Forest Service and DNR and the local soil and water conservation districts and local conservation groups, and everybody's getting together, and they're trying to restore white pine, white cedar, white spruce all along the North Shore. And they're getting some money. There's been some grants so they can pay to fence their white pines. And the North Shore, unlike most of northern Minnesota, which is national and state forest, the North Shore is mostly privately owned. So you're dealing, there's state parks every 30 miles or so that helps. But you're dealing with hundreds, if not thousands, of landowners. A huge effort to collaborate. And as Pam talked about collaboration, and other people have mentioned that too, it's beginning to turn the tide. So you're going to see a new forest coming where for about 50 years, all you saw were those birch, and then when the birch died, there was literally nothing else to take its place. So a major habitat change over the last 100 years, and kind of going back now, hopefully in the right direction. Uh-oh, we're frozen. We lost our web. lose our internet connection. Unfortunately, oh, there we go. Does that work? Am I gonna have you, should I go ding, and then you have to be really old to remember what that was. Yeah, laser point's working. That's another peril, being the last person. They wore out the battery probably. But I'll talk about this. There hasn't been much talk about mining. I know it's been a little bit discussed in our first, by Bruce when he's talked about sort of the impact of where things are going. The footprint of just the iron mining industry, and I tried to find this slide, I couldn't find it anywhere, but there's an aerial photo of the range, and Bruce talked about the 50 miles, the footprint. It's actually a lot more. It goes from here, from Brainerd, all the way to Ely. And there are old natural ore mines all over that territory. And the footprint they left from the mine, then the ore dump, which is the hill next to the mine, and now with the massive size, I mean, the Mintac tailings basin is, I think, one of the top 15 lakes in Minnesota or something. It's just a massive structure. So just the physical footprint of what mining is across Minnesota, a major habitat disturbance, a major habitat issue. You basically have segregated wildlife populations. There's corridors, but there's north of the sleeping giant and there's south in it. And that's kind of the way things are going up. If you add copper mining into that, which was my next slide, I'm sorry. I don't know. Should I sit over there, or what would be better? Should I just wave at you? Okay. All right. And this is Twin Metals drilling up southeast of Ely along the Cowishiwi River. A lot of you folks have been on Highway 1. It's a great place it used to be a great place if you wanted to go drive and see a moose. And I don't want to talk about copper mining too much because I'm sick of it. For about 15 years, up until last May, that was pretty much my life, was writing about mining, and especially copper mining. Or some people would call it sulfide mining. Because it's a loaded word, I tend not to call it sulfide mining, but it's mining in sulfide-bearing rock. And people have always said, well, what's going to happen? What if that happens? I said, well, it's probably not if, it's more of a matter of when, because it's the largest untapped copper nickel deposit in the world, definitely the US, if not the world. And very little things that have that much money involved don't happen. I mean, that's just the way it is. There's a demand for those ores. They're in every one of your cell phones, computers, they're in your Prius, they're everywhere. You've heard it, they're thousands of pounds in each wind generator you see in southwestern Minnesota that dot our pheasant country down there. So there's no doubt there's a demand. Whether you should do it literally on the shore of the most used wilderness area in the lower 48 is another question. Maybe it should be left to a more drier climate, but that's going to be for people way above our pay grade to decide. But I say to people, even if there's not a catastrophic tainting of Minnesota waters, whether it's Polymet, blowing up the St. Louis River, or Twin Metals, putting something into the Rainy River watershed, into the boundary waters. I said there will be no going back from the physical changes of the whole region. And Bruce talked about it a little bit, that when 500 miners move around up there, they don't move into town. Virginia, Hibbing, Aurora, all those towns have been decimated by population loss over the last 50 years. Decimated. St. Louis County's population has stayed about the same. Duluth population has stayed about the same, but Hermantown has grown, Esco has grown, Lakewood Township. When Northwest Airlines, later Delta, built a repair facility in Duluth back in the 90s, almost all those people who moved there, very few of them lived in the city of Duluth. They were all mechanics, they were making good money. They all bought houses out in the country. They bought 40, built a house, and each one of those is a driveway, each one of those is a septic system. Each one of those is 40 acres of fragmented habitat that's probably not going to get logged for the timber industry anymore. It's probably not going to be a good place for a wolf to hang out, maybe a deer. But that's, so the footprint, the noise, the light, the sound, hundreds of trucks, trains. This is right by Ely, and this is an area you drive by there now and you think, this is northern Minnesota. This is a Hamm's beer commercial. and that's going to be totally different forever after that. I mean, the mines might shut down, but all that other stuff is still there. I mean, the mines will shut down. They'll close down because of economic downturns. They'll close down when they're played out. You know, if all goes well, they'll be shut down correctly, so there's nothing, you know, that's going to be a long-term problem. Has never happened yet anywhere, but hopefully it'll happen here where they shut them down properly. Can you pop to the next? Oh, am I good? Thank you. This was a little guy, bat, getting a transmitter. Somebody asked me today if I ever do a story on NRRI, and there are other people who would say, how come you always do all your stories on NRRI, which is the Natural Resources Research Institute in Duluth. It's a leg of University of Minnesota Duluth. It's supposed to be finding all sorts of new economic development projects and things like peat and wood gasification, that came up, and iron ore, and developing other ores, copper, and they're doing some fascinating stuff like trying to remove sulfides from mine waste. But they also have another wing that do all this great environmental research, and they call me and say, hey, you want to go out and put collars on, transmitters on stuff. So just one of their guys, Ron Moen, some of you folks might know him or not, he's kind of a quiet guy and he doesn't seem like he's a very exciting person, but he never says no. So I'll call him up and say, Ron, let me go out. So just with Ron, I've put transmitters on lynx. Sorry, Bill, there are some lynx around still. But moose, we went out in the winter and got snowmobiles stuck in helicopters, and I got to give the moose the shot to wake them back up. Wolves, turtles, which I think he's coming up here, yeah, and bats, which I didn't know you could put transmitters on bats. Now it wasn't Ron, but this summer I went out and put transmitters on warblers. Yeah, a transmitter on a warbler, maybe not, and also on baby woodcock, which we were walking around following a hunting dog that was trained, not to quite finish the job. So, and I don't know, some of you people might know Debbie Peterson Water, but anyways, and we found these you flush the mother woodcock and you find the baby and you put the transmitter on, because they really had no idea where baby woodcock go all summer long. We know eventually they fly south. We didn't really know what's going on with them. So that's another NRI study. So having NRI in my backyard, it's just been a gas, and I get to go out and do all sorts of cool stuff like that. But these, I think this is a wood turtle, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but they're on our imperiled list or threatened list, and it's because everybody wants to live on the lake, everybody wants to live on a river, that's where these little guys would go, and everybody has a driveway and their cars. Well, a huge mortality problem is cars, to the point where they find these really hotbeds of turtle egg-laying areas, and they're putting up that plastic fencing you see around construction sites, or the material, so it's supposed to stop erosion, but what they're trying to do is stop the turtle from coming out on the road. I mean, because they found these sandy, gravelly spots where they're laying all these eggs, and it's just like it's a bloodbath. I mean, the little buggers never get past the road. So the NRI, which is supposed to be studying them, and there are not very many left, they said, well, we can't study them if they're all dying, so they're literally trying to keep them off the road. So another example of how our habitat, we just keep encroaching on that and keep changing things in little ways. CWD, nobody wants to talk about it. Minnesota's actually, I think, finally getting their act together, and I mean, Ed certainly has been involved in that. I think Wisconsin just completely dropped the ball, and it's endemic there. There are places down there where every third deer has it. It's only going to get worse. And I think, I said this at first when it came out, and it didn't happen at all. I thought, this is going to change deer hunting. A lot of people are going to get out of the game. Who wants to eat something that can kill you? But it hasn't happened yet. But you're seeing more and more where people are saying, it probably can happen. You can't say it won't happen because it hasn't happened. And if that happens, I mean, it's something that wasn't even on our radar 25 years ago. Now it's in 30-some states in multiple provinces, and it's like over in a couple of foreign countries. And imagine if, when it does make that jump to humans, what that's going to do to deer hunting and what that's going to do to wildlife management. I mean, that's the driving force of wildlife management in Minnesota. That's the big daddy. And if you have a lot of people that get out of the game there, let alone what it's doing to the population and that. But so potentially, and I don't know who to blame on this. I mean, you blame the deer farm, the elk farm people. Clearly, they moved it around. I mean, that's where the hotbeds are. We've seen that literally right outside the door here in Brainerd now, where we have a CWD area, right where we are, I believe. It appears to come. I mean, all the animals in one game farm, every single one had it. One wild deer now has it up here. That's the farthest north it's been. It's getting into my backyard, but it's not that it wasn't important when it was in Houston County, but it's one of those things where it really has the potential, not necessarily a habitat issue, but it's one of those things that's going to, I think, become a huge deal if it goes further than it is. We've talked a little bit about logging, and it's an interesting thing because I was around back when there was this huge debate about whether we're logging too much or not enough, and whether we should have more mills, and it kind of got to the point where things seemed to be at an equilibrium, and then our mills started to close, and we lost all of our board plants, and then it seemed like, well, there isn't going to be enough demand, but somehow there's still demand, to the point where we have this new issue with our wildlife management areas and on all state land, where we're going to marginally increase at least how much timber we take off of state land. And from what I'm hearing, and I really can't get a straight answer on this, it really depends on who you talk to, is, well, where's this demand coming from? Blandon has shut down lines, Boise has shut down lines, we're not talking white pine, so it's not a lumber issue. So there's less demand, but apparently there's also less supply. And so that's raised the price of timber. And there's also less supply because, and this is what we sort of predicted back in the old forest fragmentation slides a few minutes ago, where everybody's buying a 40 or an 80 out in the woods. I used to argue with Wayne Brandt from the timber producers about this. Wayne, they're not going to want it logged. Oh, it's not going to be an issue. They were not worried at all about forest fragmentation. That's just an environmental issue. You wolf lovers can argue about forest fragmentation. But it came back to bite them because I was right. Those people with their 40s, they don't want it logged. They don't want it necessarily managed professionally. They want it to look like the old timber, like Mom and Dad in the Hamm's beer commercial. Gradually, as we're trying to get professional managers, wildlife and forestry, out to their land, we might convince them. But so the issue is, there's this little bit of a less supply. The price goes up. So what I'm kind of hearing is that the state land is being sought as a way to relieve price points for logging or for timber stumpage. And I'm thinking, man, that's a really bad reason to override wildlife managers and start logging more just to meet a quota on land that's federally by law says you shouldn't sell this wood to make money off it. So we'll see where that goes. I know I've talked to some of you about that already, and I wrote a couple stories about that got a little bit of traction, I think. So we'll keep moving here. Here's the issue that we were just talking about. We had an article on the front page a few weeks ago. Then we talk about other issues, not necessarily a habitat issue, but this has got to be driving Bill Berg crazy, where they're helicoptering wolves around to get them out to Isle Royale. But are we playing God here? I don't know. There was a really big wilderness faction that said, you know what, wolves are extirpated on Isle Royale. Let's let bygones be bygones and see where it goes. And then there was the side that said, look, we've already changed our climate enough, so there are very few ice bridges now between the mainland and Isle Royale. They only happen once a decade when we get a polar vortex, and it's not happening frequently enough for there to be a movement of wolves. You actually just had one leave this year. There was a couple weeks where there was frozen, and they trapped it, brought it over there, and it went right back home right away. So apparently wolves don't necessarily stay put where you leave them. But pretty big debate, and it's going to have a habitat issue, because if they don't keep wolves out there, the moose are going to wreck the island. And I mean, they literally do wreck the island because they're confined, and you've got 2,000 moose out there. So the Park Service and Phyllis Green decided we're going to go, well, it's actually decided for them by a couple of U.S. senators and some heavy pressure from Michigan Tech folks. But the wolves are back out there. They're going to bring a few more in. They brought a few more in last winter from Canada, where they were killing all the caribou on a couple of islands. But kind of an interesting issue where we're it's a little different than the Yellowstone reintroduction, where they weren't quite extirpated. There was 2 left. But just to think about things like bringing animals back where they aren't anymore, where they weren't anymore. Mike Schrag's here, right? I didn't know you were going to be here. I just threw this in. For, I don't know, 5 or 6 years now, I've been writing stories about Mike's sort of groundwork efforts to see whether or not we should have a reintroduced elk population in eastern Minnesota, basically Carleton County, Northern Pines, southern St. Louis. Got really good reports from the University of Minnesota, both for habitat and amazing public buy, I think amazing, I'm going to use that word, in the 80 percentile category, even for landowners and farmers up there. So unlike northwestern Minnesota, where there's huge social inacceptance of elk, hatred, dislike, it looks like, you know, it could possibly work over here. CWD, huge looming issue. And at least one county commissioner now is apparently making it his next goal in life is to try to stop this. Nobody quite knows why, but that's a whole other story. But an interesting possible, I wanted to end on a few positive notes because there aren't a whole lot out there. But this could be a pretty neat example of, and it's worked 80 miles east of here over in Ashland County, Wisconsin. They just brought in more, they've had elk since the 90s. Kind of hanging in there, fighting off the wolves, surviving. They brought in, I think, almost 100 new animals from Kentucky, I believe. Is that right, Mike? Over the last year or so, and they're doing pretty well. They've got good buy-in from the neighbors. The elk are not going too far away. They're hanging out. They're not going into farms further south. So they're well liked. The tourists like them. The locals like them. You know, there's like the Elk Cafe over in Clam Lake now. So they don't always. Here's another success story. A habitat issue. This is Clough Island in the middle of the St. Louis River estuary. If you went down this way, you'd be in Duluth. Up here is towards Fond du Lac. It's called Spirit Lake. This is Wisconsin. This is actually in Wisconsin because here's the old channel goes down over here. And it's a 300 roughly acre island that in about 2006 was going to be a $250 million golf, marina, hotel, resort complex. Literally, there's no way to get to the island. They were talking about a gondola. There's no road anywhere near it. The land on the Superior side is dedicated forest easement, city forest, so there's no way you could build a road here. The best thing that ever happened to Clough Island was the recession of 2008 and 2009, because the golf went in the tank. Nobody started, the number of rounds of golf played is, nobody's building golf courses anymore. The marina developer lost all his money. One of the other guys went bankrupt. So the guys who were left sold the land to, I think, the Nature Conservancy, and it's now, I believe, in the hands of the Wisconsin DNR. Wonderful habitat for, you know, shorebirds, waterfowl. I was out fishing right over here with a guy in a Monday night fishing league, and they were catching bluegills, and there was 2 eagles nested right in here. I mean, it's just all sorts of stuff comes with it. It's probably a good rookery for a lot of fish species. So there's an example of how you got a nonprofit and a state agency and a bunch of local support and the largest recession since the Great Depression. Thank God for that. So here's another one, another good thing. This is the Rila Forest Initiative. Minnesota Power bought Taconite Harbor many years ago from Cleveland Cliffs, when Taconite Harbor used to be where they shipped the ore from the Erie mining over in White Lakes, which is where Polymet's going to be. And Minnesota Power didn't really know what to do with their forest lands. They broke off some of it and gave it to a wing that they made into a private nonprofit called the Royale Forest Foundation, named after Jack Rila, who many of you know is kind of the godfather of white pine in Minnesota. Everybody else had sort of given up on white pine 30 years ago because of blister rust and white-tailed deer. Jack kept going, kept bringing up new varieties, didn't invent, but sort of helped mastermind bud capping to keep the deer away. And so Minnesota Power is now giving this to this Rila Forest Initiative. It's on Moose Creek, 1,200 acre site on Lake County. It's on the Manitou River, it's on 9 Mile Creek and Moose Creek. All 3 of them are trout streams. So this land is now in conservation easement, owned by a nonprofit, managed by a nonprofit, but with an eye towards not just wildlife and fish development, but also commercial timber harvest as needed. Not a quota, but as needed. So it's these initiatives, like to put that together, Blandon's done the same thing with spread of 40s, 80s, you know, being broken up and kind of invasion. Oh, how did that get in there? That was a 26-pound trophy from Houston County, where they're probably native. Okay, they're probably native down there this spring. And Bill stole my show. I get this all the time. It says, well, ever since we had turkeys up here, we don't have any grouse anymore. Pam mentioned it too. And I don't know, there's all these rumors that turkeys, eat baby grouse. And I'm thinking, well, they probably will. I know deer eat baby ducks. They've got video of that. I mean, pretty much things will eat anything. And I know they eat snakes, but there's no science. And Bill is right. We did a major species reintroduction with no environmental impact statement. They just gave a bunch of money to the Wild Turkey Federation, which I used to be a member of, and they said, go. And they went, and now we've got them literally to the border. They're all the way up in Coochin County now. And they're surviving, and they're amazingly doing well. Somehow, probably because enough people they're finding deer feeders or what, because they're not scratching through 2 feet of snow. I don't know how they're doing it. But so it's a success story. Yeah, I gave up steelhead fishing because I like turkey hunting so much. I just think it's a blast. And I go all over doing that. But, was that the right thing for northern Minnesota? I don't know. There are other things we could talk about over cocktails or something, but I'm just going to leave it the rest of my time. I thought I'd have more open. But anyways, thank you guys for having me. I'm not quite sure why I'm here. I hope this was somewhat related to the topic. I want to thank the photographers at the News Tribune for providing all these pretty photos. But all right, any questions? Yeah.
And the same thing, their beaver population just exploded on Isle Royale because the wolves weren't there doing their job.
Right.
It's not just dogs, there's a whole bunch of things.
All the interactions, and it's amazing. The great thing about doing all this research, and somebody just asked me, I was the NRI thing. I was on a trout stream the other day with a guy who was injecting little color codes under the gills of the little baby trout, so they could see whether they're moving through beaver dams. Because everybody knows beaver dams, you got to blow them up because they ruin a trout stream. Well, it turns out that may not be so true after all. There's probably some truth to some of it, but not. And so they're actually seeing, well, what fish get through what beaver dams, and let's see, let's take this seriously. And it was just so cool to be out there watching the interactions that, we don't know what happens when we blow up a beaver dam. I remember a game warden telling me he did that once, and they flooded Highway 53, and they had to come out and close it, and he sort of slunked away with the local deputy sheriff. They didn't tell the DOT whose fault it was. So lots of things happen when you blow up beaver dams, but that's the great thing about science, and you guys know this way better than I do, is that every time you turn something else over, something else pops up, and you just don't know what's going to happen. So be careful what you wish for, because something bad might happen. And I think I know Bill and Mike and Martha, but for folks who don't know me, I have absolutely no biology background other than the fact that I've been, scrounging through the woods since I was 7 or 8 years old. It's all self-taught, not very well, but it is kind of who I am. It's what I do. So being able to live up north and do that, and then now get paid to write about it has been, it's been a dream job. But really, hanging out with you guys is actually one of the best parts of it. So I just want to say that, keep calling. Call me on the phone sometime. I got to come up with news stories all the time. Come on.
As a reporter in the media, have you seen any change in the relationship between the media and, say, natural resource agencies over time? Any observations in that respect in the current days of fake news?
Yeah. It ebbs and flows, and I think the one advantage I have of being in one place for a long time is you develop relationships. So when I call up Mike, he knows I'm not going to burn him the next day or whatever you want to call it. That's just not how I operate. But funny you should ask, because just recently I was doing a story about a restoration project on the St. Louis River, and I had heard that there was some issues with some the fire retardant chemical in a certain part of the area, in a certain lake. And so I called a couple of guys, or actually emailed a couple of guys from the Duluth office of PCA saying, hey, I'm just trying to get some background on this. I'm not writing a story right now, but what do you know? And 2 days later, got a call from the media person in Duluth saying, they can't talk to you. Our new policy is everything has to go through me. And then everything that she gets has to go through St. Paul. So it was a little bit taken aback because I'd known those two guys for 15, 20 years, and they've never had a problem with that before. So that's more of a policy thing. I don't know if it's coming from the commissioner. I think sometimes it comes from overzealous media people. The commissioner's media, the head of media relations for the PCA. I'm getting a little bit of that from DNR, but it ebbs and flows. I can call Martha or whoever, Tom Rush up in Tower, whatever, and normally get 99% of my answers, right away over the phone. I think I'm lucky because there's a relationship there. They knew my predecessor, when he was doing outdoors, Sam Cook. I've been doing it long enough. But every once in a while you get that tightening, and there's the free flow of information isn't necessarily there like you'd hope it would be. And that could be coming all the way from the governor's office too. I don't know. Got a new governor now. We have to train him in.
Have you asked Martha about logging on WMA?
I have, and unfortunately, she's not allowed to comment on that. But luckily, some of her predecessors commented extensively on it, and actually were quite upset. I don't know if you knew, but they're quite upset with the current DNR administration. And I guess we're going to talk about that afterwards. Is that sort of the plan? Okay. So let's go ahead and should we go into that? Okay.